Okay, so yeah, this talk or interview that um, some of you may watch. I'm not sure who's watched it and who hasn't, um, but for the benefit of those who might be watching the recording, interview um, by Jem Bendell, who's the founder of the Deep Adaptation Forum, and Joanna Macy, who is very well known as an activist in the originally in the context of uh, the nuclear situation in the 1980s, but also the environmental movement there and the movements for social and economic justice. But she approached that activism very differently from many people who were active at the time. And that is not from a conventional sort of, well, I'll say conventional, but not from the point of view of a political ideology or anything like that, or economic theory, but from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy and practice. And particularly looking at how we deal with our emotional responses to the point where we begin to become aware on a heart level, not just simply with our intellect, of how grave are the threats to our human civilization. And at the time, as I say, it was possibly more the nuclear arms race, which really did pose a very real possibility of completely destroying civilization, possibly even, well, certainly bringing perhaps, the advanced life on the planet to an end. Whether that be the case or not, certainly a catastrophe greater than anything that had ever been conceived of before, if that full-scale global nuclear war had occurred. It's still not impossible that that might happen, but it certainly seems much less likely. And now the catastrophe of a global nature that people are wrestling with, trying to understand, and particularly trying to understand how we can constructively respond to this situation. That was an even bigger, potential. Never happened. It hasn't happened. I mean, it could possibly still happen, but it's now much less likely. So we're not really looking at that so much now, but at the time, this was something that was an imminent possibility of really total annihilation of our civilization and probably our species. How do you deal with the emotional responses once you do open your emotional self, your heart, to the reality of that overwhelming possibility? That was the work that Joanna Macy was doing in the 1980s, and that's when I met her and trained with her for a brief time, and as a facilitator for the workshops she was doing, which were then called Despair and Empowerment workshops. How do we go through our reactions of despair, which were very widespread at the time, to a sense of empowerment? There's something we can do. And there were two elements particularly that she emphasized in that process. Very interesting workshops, actually used a lot of very interesting methods, combination of sort of methods taken from sort of different forms of psychotherapy and group work and so on, together with Buddhist meditations and things adapted from those. Very skillful. But the essence of what she was doing was to say, first of all, we need to fully acknowledge and get in touch with and experience those difficult emotions, whether it be despair, rage, all of these very challenging emotions that this situation can arouse. And then her experience was that once people go through that experience together, it creates a very deep bond of connection, much deeper than simply a shared ideology could create. So we break through the level of our thinking, mind, our merely intellectual understanding, to a heart understanding and a shared sense of collective identity. And so from that comes a sense of empowerment. As a single individual confronting this huge global threat, how do I find any sense of agency, of being able to do something? Only by breaking out of that limited identity as a separate self and connecting, not just recognizing philosophically that I'm connected to everybody else, but directly experiencing that and experiencing my own agency as part of a collective movement. So she's dedicated her entire life since, it was a few years before I met her. I believe it was in 1977. And I think she spoke about that in the video, how, she started her journey. Though she had been active, in a more kind of conventional way about environmental issues and so on. But she had this profound experience of it going much deeper than she'd previously experienced, and kind of taking, into her whole being this felt sense of the reality of this threat and how shocking and dreadful. She said it was the seeing somebody clubbing a baby seal to death. Well, of course, we know that that's happening. It's not any secret that dreadful things like this are happening. Crimes against nature are happening all the time on a big scale. But she was saying she was sitting in front of a TV screen watching a video loop of this, and was so tired she couldn't really get up and walk away. And that experience initiated some kind of personal transition into a deeper level of awareness and a deeper level of commitment to action and so on. That has stayed with her ever since, and so that's about 50 years ago. So once that immediate threat of nuclear annihilation had receded, her work moved into workshops called Deep Ecology and Deep Time, still looking at, how do we confront the challenges of this time, the global threat to not just human civilization, but the entire planetary ecosystem that our excessive industrial activities and so on, and our neglect of ecological balance and so on, that our you might say misguided collective human behavior has brought about. How do we, stay connected to those deep emotional responses without being overwhelmed by them? And how do we stay connected to each other? Because it's only through being connected to each other that we can actually handle the overwhelming impact of these realizations. Once they penetrate below the intellectual level and we experience that colossal tragedy, that it's not just something that may occur in the future. I mean, it's happening all the time. Ecological tragedy is happening continuously. And the present situation with COVID-19, although of course it is a serious problem, and a great deal of suffering, both physical and mental suffering, and death is occurring. And that is very much in the uppermost and in the forefront of everybody's mind at the moment, because it stands out against the background of what was happening before. That is, it does stand out against that background for the minority of the world who do live in relatively privileged, relatively affluent circumstances, and for whom the threat to their life is of a different order from what it is most of the time. For most of the world, it's not of a different order. There are threats of that level of threat to life, well-being, security, which are present all the time to most people on the African continent, a great many people in the Asian, South Asian subcontinent, South America, and a great many people living on the margins of the more affluent societies. And that's a much bigger number of people than it was, say, 50 years ago, because our societies become much more unequal and divided. So suffering on a big scale is actually normal in human history and in human evolution. But there is this exceptional situation that's happened very recently where a large section of humanity is kind of insulated from that constant level, high level of serious physical suffering, death, and so forth. And the proposition that is the basis of Jem Bandel's Deep Adaptation Forum is that this is not going to continue for much longer. This, if you like, bubble that we're so fortunate to live in, and we need to, we need to have gratitude for that. We have been blessed to live in an incredibly, unbelievably fortunate time where we can have levels of comfort and affluence and safety that were previously unknown. Before 100 years ago, hardly anybody had, or nobody probably had, these levels of safety, comfort, well-being, affluence, and so on. But Jem Bendel is saying this isn't going to continue. So this is in the context of climate change. So for the last 30 years, I guess, and the problem was known about before, but I think it came to the fore in the early 1990s, especially with the Kyoto Conference and the Kyoto Treaty and so on. The fact that climate change was not just something that some scientists were speculating might happen, but that there was a very credible, well-attested scientific consensus that if we continued burning fossil fuels at the rate that we were doing and the rate of increase at which they were increasing, then we were certainly going to bring about serious climate change of the order of a few degrees, perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees of global warming. And certainly at the upper end of that scale, although it doesn't sound much, that is a catastrophe beyond reckoning. The effects of that on our civilization would be cataclysmic, beyond anything that has been experienced since maybe the time of the Black Death. As 50% of people across the world perhaps died in that pandemic. Now the population is much larger, so there'll be many more people. And if we do experience severe climate change, like 4, 5, 6 degrees, the best scientific analyses seem to indicate that probably we would lose 50% or more of our population. Some think all. I think that's unlikely. I think we're very adaptable species. We're very resourceful. We are spread across the globe. I don't think that we're going to see the human population wiped out. But I think we are going to see very large loss of life. The planet is currently supporting a colossal population of humans, and that the basis of that survival economically, and in terms of the resources that we need and the productivity of the land that is needed to support that population under conditions of severe climate change, very hard to imagine that that can be continued. And Jem Beldale pointed out in his deep adaptation paper last year, we've been saying for a long time, only a few years, we've only got a few years left in order to solve the problem of climate change. In 2008, there was a big movement around the idea of 100 months. We have 100 months, 2008. If you work it out, that's 12 years ago. No, sorry, it's 8 years. It's 8 years, isn't it? So 4 years ago, the time would have run out if that estimate was correct. But no progress has been made towards reducing carbon emissions. They've continued to increase. So he's saying, looked at dispassionately and objectively, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that we have already run out of time. We will not be able to prevent severe climate change. So we need to prepare for it, and we need to think about how are we going to navigate our way through what will be an ecological tragedy of unprecedented dimensions. That's a very dark message indeed. And Joanna Macy, gave him a very moving tribute, saying, you are a very brave man to be willing to stand up and say this. And I agree, very courageous thing to do, to say, we're going to have to get out of our fix-it mode of thinking about these things. How can we fix it? What technical fix can we find to stop this climate catastrophe from happening? It's going to happen. Now, nothing is certain. Okay, nothing is absolutely certain about the future, certainly. But it would seem wise, given all the circumstances and all the evidence, to say we need to prepare, because we may well not be able to fix it. So what does this mean if we're looking at it from the point of view of this emerging idea of eco-dharma? I think the Dharma teachings have a great deal to bring to this situation. In fact, I personally believe at this moment I'm coming to the idea that the Dharma teachings are really central to this situation, this problem. How do we respond constructively to such a devastating situation? And I come back again to the Buddha. The Buddha left his home, left his beloved wife and his newborn infant child, whom he had not seen, to go into the forest and meditate and practice austerities. Why? Because he saw so deeply into the reality, the magnitude, the devastating nature of human suffering, and he could do no other. So I think what we're looking at when we are willing to open our eyes and our minds and our hearts to this truth that Jem Bandel is inviting us to look at, we're doing exactly the same as what the Buddha did. Most people never go that deep to really understand and take in the meaning, the magnitude, the vastness of this truth of suffering. So this is partly why I took us on this little time travel journey in the meditation. This is nothing new. Humans have always lived, existed against a background of terrible suffering and death, danger, disease, war, famine, pandemic, catastrophe of one kind and another. We happen to live in an extraordinarily fortunate time where we are able to kind of turn off from the awareness of that, because we are living in a very, very rare and privileged situation. So this is, let's meditate regularly on the precious human rebirth and death awareness. That the precious human rebirth, we should bring to that, not just, well, I may not have a human body, tomorrow, but I may not be living in this situation of affluence, plenty, and here we are, that comfortable, privileged, unusual situation that we are now used to has been taken from us for a period of a few weeks, and maybe going to go on for a few weeks longer, or maybe even a couple of months. Some of us have got very ill. A few of us have died. It's still, although, the numbers are very scary, 200,000 deaths approaching. We have to remember that the number of deaths that will occur this year is at least 100 million. And we, if that wasn't happening, then we'd be in trouble, because the population will continue to explode, which is, it's very dangerous. So it's inevitable. Human beings do die. In most times in history, most times in our evolutionary history, even more so, before there was civilization, dying before the age of 50 or 60 was the norm. Now it's a small number of people that that's happening to, and a bigger number of people that are going through some, serious distress and fear of the disease that is happening. But what we are heading into is something much bigger. So I'm not belittling the COVID crisis. It is a global crisis. It's very serious. There is a great deal of suffering. The fear is not unjustified, and so on and so on. I'm trying to put it into a bigger perspective. That, this is a big catastrophe and a big problem in relation to the situation we've become used to, because civilization has managed to create an incredibly privileged and comfortable situation for us. And that's very positive. It's good, not knocking it. But it means that we lose sight of that big truth that the Buddha confronted, and that is the source and foundation of the Dharma. It was the Buddha's realization of the magnitude, the depth, the gravity of the problem of human suffering that motivated him to go and seek enlightenment and to achieve enlightenment and then to teach. So I wonder what the waking up that is happening around the world, around the problem of climate change, and currently focused on the COVID-19 situation, which is kind of an aspect of the bigger ecological transition that is happening with the human species, that we've become totally globalized. We can fly around anyway, we can't at the moment, but until a few weeks ago, people could go anywhere, anytime. So problems like this become global, where they previously would have been local. So the pressure on us to evolve with lightning speed into a global ecological community where the truth of interdependence is universally recognized. If we cannot achieve this transition, this shift in consciousness, this evolutionary leap, then the future looks very, very dark indeed. But my own gut feeling, my own intuition is this evolutionary leap is occurring. And the climate crisis is, if you like, looked at in Buddhist terms, it is simply the karmic consequence of the fact that for the past few hundred years of the Industrial Revolution and so on, and it's a much longer process than that. The Industrial Revolution is the culmination of an evolutionary change that's occurred in human society since we invented agriculture, basically. That has been leading us into greater and greater imbalance with the global ecosystem. We kind of started eating more and more of that ecosystem. We've become very dangerously successful as a species in terms of, we talk about successful species. These are ones that manage to increase their populations very successfully and spread over a large part of the earth. Our population has increased to astronomical levels, and we've spread right across the globe. And we are a very voracious species. We tend to consume our environment. We've done that. But this is not written into our genes. We have other ways of responding as well. I've been reading a very, very interesting book, which I recommend, by an Australian zoologist called Tim Flannery, called Here on Earth. Very interesting book about this evolutionary journey and this destructive behavior by humans. We tend to get very upset about it and say people are being very wicked. He said, no, this is, you can compare it with other species. These are tendencies in evolution that are they've occurred for evolutionary reasons, and species like this that use our kind of strategies of evolution to become very successful, and then they tend to overconsume their environment, and then the population collapses. It's very normal. But we do have an evolutionary resource that no previous species has ever had. The ability to actually understand this evolutionary process itself and reflect on it. And also to critique our own ways of thinking and ways of acting, and to find ways of training ourselves to think and act differently, which is what spiritual practice is about. It's a huge topic, really. I suppose, and I try to kind of sum it up in a few words. Very difficult, but it's kind of like this evolutionary crisis. Any evolutionary crisis, and they are common in evolution, is a normal feature of evolution, that it proceeds through, things go awry, and there's an evolutionary crisis, and there's a massive change to the balance of the ecosystem. Some species die off, other species flourish. The environment changes as a result, and we sort of talked about Gaia theory, how the evolution of the species and the evolution of the environment are coupled together. So evolutionary crises call forth creative evolutionary responses from life. And we are in that process now. And this present evolutionary crisis is calling forth a change in human consciousness that is visible. If you go looking for it, you can see it all over the place. And the COVID-19 situation is accelerating this. It's being a catalyst for a massive expansion of some of the tools of consciousness change that this phrase change agents is now used quite a lot. It's quite an interesting phrase, actually, because it brings together people working in the fields of psychotherapy, people working in the fields of political activism, environmental activists, or not just activists, but in terms of, we think about protests and things like that, political things, but people who are activists in the sense that they are practicing sustainable, ways of living and ways of growing food and so on. bringing together lots of people who previously, would have been classified as very different, but people who are whose orientation is towards how can we bring about a change in um, the human way of life and thought and awareness and how we interact with one another. That is what is needed for us to survive and flourish, and for the whole ecosystem to survive and flourish as we go through this evolutionary transition. So when Joanna Macy talks about the Great Turning, and she said, there was a period, I think, where she was a little bit perplexed about what to say, because she'd seen this shift in consciousness happening, over a period of years. And then people were saying, well, it isn't happening, looks like we're headed downwards in a nosedive towards over the edge of the precipice of climate change, ultimate catastrophe. Well, it can feel like that, it can look like that, but I don't think that is the truth. I think that cataclysmic as the effects of major climate change will be, unless some kind of almost miracle happens, I think, cataclysmic though those changes will be, they will not be the end for the human species or for the ecosystem. Ecosystem will change. It's changing faster now than it's changed for perhaps millions of years, certainly for many thousands of years. And there was a big change about 12,000 years ago, when we emerged from the Ice Age. There was last Ice Age, many Ice Ages. There was a much bigger change, 50 million years ago. I forget the names of the exact geological eras and so on, but we've seen those catastrophic, gigantic, colossal changes to the global ecosystem. These are, if you like, they are developmental stages of the Gaia superorganism that we're all part of. They can be seen that way, and I think that is an accurate way to see them. That is, Gaia is going through another stage in its evolution. And these don't all happen slowly. Sometimes they happen with lightning speed. So here we're talking over a period of, well, say, since the humans invented agriculture, that has transformed the face of the planet completely. And then since we invented industry and the burning of fossil fuels and so on, we've transformed the entire global ecosystem yet again in a couple of 100 years. And now the climate change that is happening as a result of that, there's going to be even bigger changes to the ecosystem happening over the next century or so. And then it may begin to settle down. We don't know. It's difficult to know what's going to happen. But this is a situation we're facing. We have this unique evolutionary resource of the ability to understand that situation and to change our behavior and our way of thinking. And I think, once again, that certainly spiritual teachings more generally, and perhaps Buddhist teachings in particular, others are equally relevant in many ways, the Sufi tradition, the Christian contemplative tradition, the Hindu tradition, other, I don't place them in any rank order of which are better. But I do think, for various reasons, that the Buddhist tradition has a particular role to play. It's interesting to see how prominent it is right now in America, which is kind of like the epicenter of this evolutionary shift in many ways. So I want to just emphasize again a point that perhaps I haven't brought out strongly enough, but there is this very dark picture of what's in the immediate future, the next 100 years or so, and possibly longer, we don't know. And against that, there is this recognition that what this looks like, is certainly what it looks like to me, is this is an evolutionary transition. It is not the end of everything. And what's on the other side may be equally as positive as that dark picture is negative. So as Joanna Macy says, the Great Turning is, it will be happening as we go through this evolutionary tunnel, this very challenging period in our, human story, where it now seems it is too late for us to avert this catastrophe. It is going to happen, and perhaps it always was going to happen. I think quite possibly. There was from the beginning, no realistic possibility of this event or process of what do we call it, of severe climate change. It was kind of it was going to unfold, just as our evolution from becoming hunter-gatherers to becoming agriculturalists, to becoming the building of mercantile economy, to harnessing fossil fuel energy, to harnessing nuclear energy and flight and space flight and all of these things. This is all an evolutionary story. And there have been many catastrophic episodes, and catastrophes are normal in evolution. One day we may acquire the ability to prevent them, but I wonder whether we could in any way, would it have been possible for us to prevent this catastrophe? I'm not sure that it would. So if that's so, then it is about simply acknowledging the reality that we are living in. This is the first noble truth. Life in this world is pervaded by deep suffering. And we can really grow to spiritual maturity and become ultimately enlightened or liberated spiritually by fully acknowledging and taking in the depth and magnitude of this truth. And that's always been so. But now we have a new context in which to work with this challenge. And once again, I think that the Dharma community perhaps has a special role to play here. I'm very interested in teachers like Thomas Hübl and others, John Macy as well, who have brought together insights from traditional Buddhism with insights from modern psychotherapy and psychology and so on, to create what I think we have to call a new form of spirituality. So Thomas Hübl occasionally mentions teachers like the Buddha, but he's not giving us a Dharma talk in the traditional sense at all, You don't have to have any interest in Buddhism to appreciate his teachings. So I think that the Dharma itself is evolving, and eco-Dharma is one way in which, direction in which I think it's a very important direction that I think it's evolving. And I think, the present crisis is highlighting how, as we've been each in our individual ways, some of us for many years, plodding away with our Buddhist journey, not thinking that, our individual contribution is likely to be anything very sort of massive in the short term. But now I think, we may be seeing sort of big upsurge in the demand, if you like, for our product. And I think this is great, I think this is great. And I think it's, we can be grateful for that opportunity. So I'll leave it there and see what comes up in the discussion. Thank you.